The chains around Alara's wrists were cold, but her hands were warmer than any fire in the room. She pressed them against the wound on the soldier's chest, and the torn skin began to knit together, before the guards even finished locking the door behind her. This was her life now. Heal, retreat to the small stone room she was given, wait for the next wounded body to be dragged before her. She had stopped counting the days somewhere after the second winter. The soldier on the table groaned and opened his eyes. He looked at her the way most of them did, with a mix of relief and suspicion, as if her gift were a trick rather than a mercy. Alara said nothing. She had learned long ago that words only invited more questions, and questions only led to trouble. She wiped her hands on the cloth at her side and stepped back, waiting for the guard to escort her away. But tonight, the guard did not come. Instead, the heavy wooden door groaned open, and the room fell silent in a way that made the hair on Alara's arms rise. She knew that silence. It was the silence that followed power, the kind that walked into a room and made everyone else shrink without a single word being spoken. Cale Ravenwood stood in the doorway. She had heard whispers of his return for days, carried through the healing wing by nervous servants and wounded soldiers who spoke his name like a warning. The old king was dead, and his son had come back from the border wars to claim what was his. Alara had imagined many things about the new Alpha King, but nothing prepared her for the way the room seemed to bend toward him, the way even the injured soldier on the table tried to sit up straighter despite his pain. Cale did not look at the soldier. He looked at her. "You are the healer," he said. It was not a question. Alara lifted her chin, refusing to let her voice shake. "I am the one they bring the wounded to, if that is what you mean." A faint, unreadable expression crossed his face. He stepped closer, his boots silent against the stone floor despite his size, and Alara found herself holding her breath without meaning to. Up close, he was younger than she expected, though there was nothing young about the way he studied her, as if he were reading a book written in a language only he understood. "Show me your hands," he said. She hesitated. No one had ever asked her that before. They took her hands when they needed healing and forgot they existed the rest of the time. She held them out slowly, palms up, and watched as he leaned down to examine them, his gaze lingering on the faint lines etched into her skin, lines that had been there since before she could remember, lines no ordinary Omega carried. "Interesting," he murmured, almost to himself. "Interesting is not usually a word used to describe a prisoner," Alara said before she could stop herself. His eyes lifted to hers, and for a moment, something flickered there that she could not name. Not anger, not quite amusement either, something closer to curiosity, sharp and unblinking. "You speak boldly for someone wearing a collar," he said. "I have little else left to lose," she replied. "Boldness is cheap when everything else has already been taken." He studied her for a long moment, long enough that the soldier on the table shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing to be anywhere else. Finally, Cale straightened and turned toward the door, pausing only to glance back at her over his shoulder. "I will be watching the healing wing more closely from now on," he said. "See that nothing changes in how you do your work." Then he was gone, and the room exhaled as one. That night, Alara lay on the thin cot in her small stone room, staring at the ceiling and turning the strange encounter over in her mind. She had met alphas before, cruel ones and indifferent ones, but never one who looked at her hands as though they held a secret worth uncovering. She told herself it meant nothing. Alphas were curious about everything they did not understand, and her gift had always confused people who tried to explain it with ordinary logic. Still, sleep did not come easily. The next morning, a young guard named Owen came to fetch her earlier than usual. He was not unkind, not like some of the others, and he often slipped her an extra piece of bread when no one was watching. Today, though, his expression was tight with unease. "The king wants you in the East Wing," he said. "Not the healing room. His private study." Alara's stomach dropped. Prisoners summoned to private studies rarely returned with good news. She followed Owen through the winding stone corridors of the Ravenwood stronghold, past tall windows that let in thin bars of gray morning light, past guards who watched her with the same wary curiosity the soldier had shown the night before. The study was nothing like she expected. She had imagined cold stone and weapons on the walls, but instead, she found shelves lined with old books, their spines cracked with age, and a large table covered in scrolls and maps. Kale stood near the window, his back to her, and for a moment, she thought he had not noticed her arrival. "Sit," he said without turning around. "I would rather stand." That earned her a faint huff of something close to amusement. He turned then, and she saw he was holding one of the old books, its pages yellowed and brittle. He set it on the table and gestured for her to look. "Do you recognize this symbol?" he asked. Alara stepped closer, curiosity overtaking her caution despite herself. The page showed a faded illustration of two intertwined hands, one marked with a crescent moon, the other with a small cluster of stars. Something about it tugged at the edges of her memory, like a word on the tip of her tongue that refused to surface. "No," she said, though the word felt like a lie even as she spoke it. Kale watched her closely. "You hesitated." "I hesitate before answering anything a king asks me. It seems the wiser choice." He almost smiled at that, and the sight of it unsettled her more than his earlier sternness had. He closed the book and studied her again, the way he had studied her hands the night before, as if searching for something hidden beneath the surface. "My father kept records of every bloodline that ever served this pack," he said. "Healers, warriors, seers. Most of those lines died out generations ago. But there is one that fascinates me, because no one ever found a body, no grave, no proof of its end. Only a story of a line simply vanishing." Ilara's throat tightened, though she could not say why. "What does that have to do with me?" "Perhaps nothing," he said. "Perhaps everything." She wanted to press him further, but a knock at the door interrupted them. A tall woman with silver-streaked hair entered, her expression grave. This was Agnes, the pack's eldest healer, now retired from active duty, but still respected enough to walk into the king's study unannounced. "My king," Agnes said, "there has been an incident at the northern border. Wounded are being brought in as we speak." Kale's expression shifted instantly, the curious softness replaced by hard focus. "How many?" "A dozen, at least, some serious." He turned to Ilara. "Go with Agnes. Tend to them. We will finish this conversation another time." Ilara did not need to be told twice. She followed Agnes out of the study, grateful for the distraction, though the image of the intertwined hands in that old book stayed lodged in her mind like a splinter she could not remove. The healing wing was chaos by the time they arrived. Soldiers lay on cots lining the walls, some groaning, some eerily silent, in a way that worried Ilara more than the noise. She moved from one to the next, her hands working quickly, the familiar warmth flowing from her palms into torn skin and bruised muscle. This was the one place she felt useful, the one place her existence made sense. Hours passed in a blur of motion. By the time the last soldier was stable, the sun had already begun to set, painting the healing wing in soft orange light. Ilara sank onto a stool, exhausted, and allowed herself a rare moment of stillness. That was when Kale appeared in the doorway again, his sleeve torn, a shallow gash visible along his forearm. He must have gone to the border himself, she realized, though no one had told her the king rode out with his soldiers. "Sit," she said, echoing his words from earlier, and for the first time, she saw something like real amusement cross his face. He obeyed, lowering himself onto the cot beside her, and held out his arm. Ilara took it carefully, her fingers brushing against his skin as she examined the wound. It was not deep, nothing her gift could not mend within moments, but as her hand moved higher along his forearm, her fingers grazed something unexpected beneath his torn sleeve. A mark. Faint, almost hidden by the natural lines of his skin, but unmistakably shaped like a crescent moon. Ilara froze. The image from the old book flashed behind her eyes, the intertwined hands, the crescent, the stars. Her breath caught, and she must have gone pale, because Kale's eyes narrowed immediately. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low. "Nothing," she said quickly, too quickly. "A shadow. It was nothing." But her hand was trembling now, and they both knew it. Kale studied her face with an intensity that made her want to look away, though something kept her locked in place, caught between fear and a strange, unfamiliar pull she could not explain. "You saw something," he said. "Tell me." Ilara swallowed hard, choosing her next words with care. "I saw a mark on your arm, that is all. And it means something to you." It was not a question this time either, and she realized with a sinking feeling that lying to this man would be far harder than lying to anyone else she had ever known. She finished healing the wound in silence, her mind racing, torn between the safety of ignorance and a growing, undeniable curiosity about the mark burned into her memory and the one now hidden beneath the king's torn sleeve. When she finally spoke again, her voice was quieter than she intended. "I do not know what it means, but I think I have seen it before. Somewhere I cannot remember." Kale's gaze held hers, steady and unblinking, and in that moment, Elara understood that whatever answer waited for her, it would not stay buried much longer. He rose from the cot, testing his healed arm with a small twist of his wrist, and for a moment, he seemed almost reluctant to leave. Then his expression hardened again, the mask of the Alpha King settling back over his features like armor. "Rest tonight," he said. "Tomorrow, you and I will speak again, properly this time." "Is that an order?" Elara asked. "It is a request," he said, "though I suspect you already know I am not used to making those." He left without another word, and Elara sat alone in the healing wing, long after the last lantern had been dimmed, staring at her own palms, as though they might finally reveal the secret they had kept from her all her life. She thought of the crescent moon mark beneath his sleeve, the intertwined hands in the old book, the strange pull in her chest she refused to name. None of it made sense, and yet all of it felt like pieces of a puzzle she had been carrying without realizing it. Owen found her there an hour later, sweeping the floor with quiet efficiency, his eyes flicking toward her every so often with poorly hidden concern. "You look like you have seen a ghost," he said. "Maybe I have," Elara murmured. He set the broom aside and lowered his voice, glancing toward the door, as though the walls themselves might be listening. "The king does not summon healers to his study. Not once, in all the years I have served here. Whatever he wants with you, it is not ordinary business." "I know," she said. "Be careful," Owen said. "Alphas do not chase curiosities without reason. If he thinks you are useful to him in some new way, he will not let you go easily, and if he decides you are a threat instead—" He did not finish the sentence, but he did not need to. Elara had lived long enough in captivity to understand exactly how that sentence ended. She returned to her small stone room as the last light faded from the narrow window, and for the first time in years, she found herself wishing she could remember more of her life before the collar, before the healing wing, before the endless gray days of captivity. Her earliest memory was smoke and heat, and the sound of her own screaming, followed by nothing but a blur of strange faces and stranger places, until she woke one day in the Ravenwood stronghold with chains on her wrists, and no name of her own, until someone gave her one. Elara. It was not the name her mother had called her. She was almost certain of that, though she could never recall what that true name had been. She lay down on the thin cot and closed her eyes, but sleep refused to come easily. Every time she drifted toward it, she saw the crescent moon mark again, glowing faintly beneath her closed eyelids, like an ember refusing to die. She saw the old book, the intertwined hands, the stars. She saw Kale's face, sharp and searching, looking at her as though she were something rare and dangerous all at once. Somewhere deep in the stronghold, past the healing wing, past the private study lined with ancient books, Kale stood alone by a tall window, staring out at the dark shape of the mountains beyond the walls. He had not told the healer everything he suspected. He had not told her that the mark on his own arm had appeared only recently, in the weeks since he took the throne, or that the old records spoke of a bond between the Ravenwood bloodline and a line of healers long thought extinct. He had also not told her that the mark only ever appeared on an Alpha King in the presence of the one bloodline meant to walk beside him. Kale pressed his palm against the cool glass of the window and exhaled slowly, his mind circling back again and again to the healer's trembling hand against his skin, to the flicker of recognition in her eyes before she tried to hide it. Whoever she truly was, and wherever she had truly come from, one thing had become clear to him in that single, charged moment in the healing wing. Elara was not simply a captive Omega with a useful gift. She was the answer to a question the Ravenwood bloodline had been asking for generations, and he intended to find out exactly how deep that answer went, no matter what secrets it forced to the surface. A hand closed around Elara's arm before she had taken 3 steps down the corridor, yanking her sideways into the shadow of a stone pillar. She gasped and spun, ready to fight, until she saw the face glaring down at her belonged to Edmund, the king's chief advisor, a thin man whose eyes always looked like they were calculating the cost of everything they touched. You will stay away from him, Edmund hissed, his grip tightening. Whatever game you think you are playing, healer, it ends now. I am not playing any game, Elara said, trying to twist free. The king summoned me. I did not ask to be dragged into his study. And yet here you are, twice in 2 days, filling his head with questions about bloodlines and old symbols. Edmund's voice dropped lower, sharper. I have served this pack for 20 years. I watched his father die. I will not watch some collared Omega unravel everything we have built, because the new king finds her curious. Elara's heart pounded, but she refused to let her fear show on her face. She had learned long ago that showing fear only invited more of it. If you have a problem with the king's decisions, perhaps you should take it up with him, instead of threatening a healer in a hallway. Edmund's grip tightened painfully, and for a moment she thought he might actually strike her. Then a voice cut through the corridor like a blade. Let go of her. Cale stood at the far end of the hall, his expression unreadable, though something dangerous flickered behind his eyes. Edmund released Elara at once, stepping back with the practiced ease of a man who had spent years learning exactly how far he could push before retreating. My king, Edmund said smoothly. I was simply reminding the healer of her place within these walls. Her place, Cale said, walking closer, is wherever I decide it is, not wherever you decide to grab her in a hallway. Edmund's jaw tightened, but he bowed his head. Of course. My apologies. He left without looking at Elara again, though the warning in his eyes lingered long after he disappeared around the corner. Cale watched him go, then turned his attention to her, his gaze softening slightly as he studied the faint red marks left on her arm. Are you hurt? He asked. I have survived worse than an advisor's temper, Elara said, though her voice trembled slightly, despite her best effort to steady it. Cale's jaw tightened at that, an unspoken understanding passing between them of exactly what she meant by worse, though neither of them spoke it aloud. He gestured for her to follow him, and this time she did not argue, curiosity outweighing her caution as they made their way back toward his study. Inside, the old book from the day before still lay open on the table. The crescent moon and stars, illustration facing upward, as though waiting for them both to return to it. Edmund does not trust easily, Cale said, closing the door behind them. He fears anything that might threaten the stability of this pack, especially now, so soon after my father's death. He is not wrong to be cautious. He is only wrong about the source of the threat. And what do you believe the source of the threat is? Elara asked. Cale studied her for a long moment before answering. I do not think you are a threat at all. I think you might be the opposite. He moved to the shelf behind his desk and retrieved another book, older and more fragile than the first, its cover cracked with age. He set it beside the first and opened it carefully, revealing pages filled with names, dates, and small illustrated symbols beside each entry. These are the recorded bloodlines of this pack, he said. Warriors, seers, healers, all bonded to serve alongside the Ravenwood line for generations. Most bloodlines eventually died out or faded into ordinary families, but one line simply vanished, all at once, with no record of what happened to them. He turned to a page near the back of the book, where a single entry stood apart from the others, its ink slightly faded but still legible. Elara leaned closer and felt her breath catch in her throat. The Lysaria. Beside the name was the same symbol from the first book. 2 intertwined hands, one marked with a crescent moon, the other marked with a cluster of stars. They were healers, Cale continued, though not ordinary ones. Legend says their gift ran deeper than any other healing line before or since, strong enough to mend wounds no other healer could touch, strong enough to sense danger to the pack before it arrived. They were bonded to the Ravenwood Alphas by blood, not by choice, a connection passed down through generations on both sides. What happened to them? Elara asked quietly, though some part of her already dreaded the answer. No one knows for certain, Cale said. The records simply stop. One entry mentions a great fire, and after that, nothing. No births, no deaths, no marriages, as though the entire bloodline vanished from history in a single night. Elara's hands had begun to tremble again, and this time she did not try to hide it. A fire. The word struck something deep and buried within her, a memory she had spent years trying not to touch, smoke and heat, and the sound of her own voice, screaming a name she could no longer remember. Elara. Kale said gently, noticing the change in her expression. What is it? I do not know, she said, though her voice shook. I keep seeing fire when I think about it. I have always seen fire, ever since I can remember, but I never knew why. Kale's expression sharpened with quiet intensity. How far back do your memories go? Not far, she admitted. I remember waking up in this stronghold with a collar on my wrist, and no name of my own. Before that, there is only fire, and smoke, and voices I cannot place. Everything else is gone. Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions. Neither of them was ready to voice. Kale closed the old book slowly, his gaze distant, as though piecing together a puzzle that had haunted his family for generations, far longer than she had been alive. I want to help you remember, he said finally. Why? Alara asked. Why does this matter so much to you? He met her eyes, and for the first time since she had known him, his carefully guarded expression slipped just enough to reveal something raw underneath it, something that looked almost like hope. Because if you are who I believe you might be, he said quietly, then you are not simply a captive healer who happened to end up in my stronghold. You are the last piece of a bond this pack lost generations ago, and I intend to understand exactly what that means, for both our sakes. Before Alara could respond, a sharp knock interrupted them, and Owen burst into the room without waiting for permission, his face pale and urgent. My king, he said breathlessly, there is a matter at the southern gate. A group claiming to be traitors wishes entry, but the guards say their wagons carry weapons hidden beneath the grain, and one of them asks specifically for the healer by description, not by name. Kale's expression hardened instantly, the softness from moments before vanishing entirely. Description. A young woman, with pale hair and markings on her hands, Owen said. They described her almost exactly. Alara's blood ran cold. No one outside the stronghold had ever seen her hands closely enough to describe the faint lines etched into her skin, not since she arrived here years ago. Whoever waited at the southern gate had either seen her before, long before her memory began, or they had been searching for her specifically, using a description passed down from someone who remembered exactly what she looked like before the fire ever touched her life. Kale turned to her, his expression grim and resolute. Stay here, lock the door behind me. Do not open it for anyone but Owen or myself. What if they are looking for me? Alara asked, fear creeping into her voice despite her effort to sound steady. Then we will find out exactly why, Kale said, but not before I make certain you are safe. He left with Owen at his side, and Alara stood alone in the study, staring down at the old book still open on the table, the crescent moon and stars staring back up at her like a question she had spent her entire remembered life avoiding. Somewhere beyond these walls, strangers had come searching for a healer with markings on her hands, and Alara had the growing, terrible certainty that whatever answers waited at the southern gate, they would not bring her the peace she had hoped for. They would only confirm that the fire in her memory had never truly finished with her at all. Alara paced the length of the study, her mind racing faster than her feet could carry her. She counted the shelves of books, the patterns in the wooden floor, anything to keep her thoughts from spiraling toward the southern gate and whatever waited there. She thought of Owen's words, description, not by name, and the phrase kept circling back through her mind like a cold wind that refused to settle. Whoever these traitors were, they had known enough about her to send someone searching, and that meant her past was no longer a mystery, locked safely behind years of silence. It was awake now, and it was looking for her. She sat down at last, forcing herself to breathe slowly, and let her gaze drift back to the open book on the table. The intertwined hands stared up at her, patient and unchanging, as they must have stared up at healers long before her, healers who shared her gift, and perhaps even her blood. She reached out and traced a finger along the faded ink, careful not to press too hard against the fragile page, and for a moment, she almost imagined she could feel warmth rising from the symbol itself, as though it recognized her touch. A soft knock came at the door sometime later, though it felt like hours rather than minutes had passed. Alara rose cautiously, remembering Kale's instructions, and called through the heavy wood before unlocking it. It is Owen, came the reply, and she opened the door to find him alone, his expression still tense but no longer as urgent as before. What happened? She asked immediately. The traitors were turned away, Owen said. The king questioned them himself. They claimed to have heard rumors from a nearby village about a healer with unusual markings, something they hoped to sell information about to interested parties. They gave no names, no clear answers, only vague stories, meant to test whether the rumors held any truth. Elara's stomach twisted. And did the king believe them? He did not, Owen said quietly. He believes they were sent to confirm your presence here, nothing more. Likely by someone who did not wish to reveal themselves directly. He has doubled the guards along the southern border and ordered increased patrols near the healing wing. Because of me, Elara said, more statement than question. Owen hesitated before nodding. The king believes your safety and the safety of this pack are now tied together in ways none of us fully understand yet. He asked me to bring you to the Great Hall. He wishes to speak with you again, this time with Agnes present as well. Elara followed him through the winding corridors, her thoughts a tangled mess of fear and cautious curiosity. She had spent years believing herself forgotten by whatever life she lived before the fire, a nameless captive whose only worth lay in her healing hands. Now, within the space of 2 days, she had learned that a bloodline once thought extinct might not be extinct at all, that a mark on the Alpha King's arm matched a symbol from her earliest fragmented memories, and that strangers beyond these walls were actively searching for someone matching her exact description. The Great Hall was quieter than she expected when they arrived, empty except for Kale standing near the towering fireplace, and Agnes seated at a long table, her expression grave and thoughtful. Kale turned as they entered, his eyes finding Elara immediately, searching her face for some sign of how she had weathered the wait. Sit, he said, gentler this time than any command he had given her before. Elara obeyed, lowering herself into the chair, across from Agnes, who studied her with the careful, measuring gaze of someone who had spent a lifetime reading people the way others read books. Tell me about the fire, Agnes said without preamble. Everything you remember, no matter how small or strange it may seem. Elara's hands tightened in her lap. She had never spoken of it aloud, not once in all her years of captivity, mostly because there had never been anyone she trusted enough to ask, and partly because the memory itself felt too fragile to touch without shattering entirely. I do not remember much, she began slowly. Smoke, thick enough that I could barely see. Heat, so intense it felt like the air itself was burning. I remember running, though I do not know from what or toward where. And I remember a voice calling a name, over and over, though I could never recall whose voice it was, or what name they called. Was it your name? Agnes asked gently. I do not think so, Elara admitted. It never felt like my name, though I cannot explain why. It felt like something older, something that belonged to someone else, or perhaps something I was meant to become. Agnes exchanged a glance with Kale, something unspoken passing between them, and Elara felt a fresh wave of unease settle over her shoulders. The Lissaria bloodline was known for something beyond their healing, Agnes said finally. Each generation, the eldest daughter was given a second name, a title passed down through the women of that line alone, spoken only within the family, and never shared beyond it. If your memory carries the echo of such a name, it would explain why it never felt like your own, and why no one outside your bloodline would recognize it. Elara's breath caught in her throat. You think I might be the last of them? I think, Agnes said carefully, that everything we have learned in the past 2 days points toward a possibility too significant to dismiss, and too dangerous to confirm carelessly. If word spreads that the last of the Lysaria bloodline still lives, and if the wrong ears hear it before we understand exactly who we are dealing with, the danger to you will only grow. Kale stepped closer, his gaze steady on Elara's face. That is why I intend to keep you close, under my protection, whether Edmund and the rest of my advisors approve or not. Whatever awaits us in uncovering the truth of your past, we will face it together, not apart. Elara looked between the two of them, the weight of everything she had learned pressing down on her chest like a stone she had carried her entire life, without realizing its shape. For the first time since she had woken in this stronghold with a collar on her wrist, and no memory of who she truly was, she felt the faint, terrifying stirrings of hope, tangled inseparably with fear, of exactly what that hope might cost her, before the truth finally came to light. A hand pressed hard against Elara's mouth in the darkness, cutting off her scream before it could leave her throat. She thrashed against the cot, her heart slamming against her ribs, fingers clawing at the arm holding her down. Moonlight barely reached through the narrow window, but she caught the glint of a blade near her attacker's other hand, close enough that she felt its cold edge brush against her collarbone. She bit down hard on the palm covering her mouth, and the attacker hissed in pain, loosening his grip just enough for her to twist free and roll off the cot onto the stone floor. She scrambled backward, opening her mouth to shout, but the door burst open before any sound escaped, and Owen's voice cut through the darkness like a blade of its own. "Stop!" The attacker turned, and in the sudden flood of torchlight from the corridor, Ilara saw his face clearly for the first time, a guard she recognized only vaguely from the Eastern Watch. Someone she had never spoken to, and never wronged, at least not knowingly. He lunged toward the window instead of toward her, clearly intending to flee rather than finish what he started, but Owen was faster, tackling him to the ground before he reached the ledge. Shouts filled the corridor within moments, guards flooding into the small room, and Ilara pressed herself against the wall, trembling, her hand instinctively touching the small cut on her collarbone, where the blade had grazed her skin. It was shallow, nothing her own gift could not heal, but the shock of it lingered far longer than the wound itself. Cale arrived before the guards had fully restrained the attacker, his expression darker than Ilara had ever seen it, a barely contained fury radiating from him as he crossed the room in 3 long strides and crouched beside her. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "A scratch," she said, though her voice shook despite her effort to steady it. Nothing more. His jaw tightened, and he turned toward the guards holding the attacker, his voice dropping to something low and dangerous. "Who sent you?" The guard said nothing, his eyes darting toward the floor, refusing to meet Cale's gaze. "Who sent you?" Cale repeated, each word slower and colder than the last. "To attack a healer under my protection, inside my own stronghold." Still, silence. Cale rose, his expression unreadable, and gestured for the guards to take the attacker away. "Lock him in the lower cells. I will question him myself once I am certain the healer is safe." The room emptied slowly, guards filing out with the captured attacker between them, until only Owen, Cale, and Ilara remained. Cale knelt beside her again, his hands hovering near her shoulders, as though he wanted to comfort her, but did not know if he had the right to. "This is my fault," he said quietly. "I should have doubled your guard the moment the traitors appeared at the southern gate." "You could not have known someone inside your own walls would try something like this," Ilara said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. Someone inside the stronghold had wanted her dead, or at least silenced, and she could not shake the feeling that Edmund's warning in the corridor had not been an idle threat after all. Cale's eyes darkened further at the thought, as though he had reached the same conclusion. "I intend to find out exactly who ordered this, and why, before the sun rises again." He insisted on moving her to a different chamber that night, one closer to his own quarters, guarded by soldiers he trusted personally, rather than the general watch. Ilara did not argue, too shaken to summon the will to resist, and found herself sitting on the edge of an unfamiliar bed sometime later, wrapped in a blanket someone had draped over her shoulders, while Cale paced near the door, like a caged animal, too restless to sit still. "You should rest," he said eventually, though he made no move to leave. "I do not think I can," Ilara admitted. "Every time I close my eyes, I feel that blade again." Cale stopped pacing and turned to face her fully, something softening in his expression, despite the tension still radiating from his shoulders. "Then let us not speak of tonight. Tell me something else instead, anything, to keep your mind elsewhere." Ilara studied him for a long moment, surprised by the request, before a small, tired laugh escaped her despite everything. "You want me to distract myself by talking to the man responsible for my captivity?" "I did not put that collar on your wrist," Cale said quietly. "My father did, long before I ever took this throne, and I intend to see it removed permanently, once I understand exactly what protecting you will require. Until then, allow me at least this much. Talk to me." Something in his voice, low and sincere, loosened a knot in Ilara's chest she had not realized was there. She found herself speaking, before she fully decided to, telling him small, meaningless things, the way she used to press herbs between her fingers as a child, to guess which ones might heal a fever, though she could not recall who taught her that. She spoke of the strange comfort she found in the healing wing, despite everything, the quiet satisfaction of watching a wound close beneath her hands, the only part of her life that had ever felt entirely her own. Cale listened without interrupting, his gaze steady and attentive, in a way no one had ever offered her before, and slowly, the trembling in her hands began to ease. "You are not what I expected," he admitted eventually, moving to sit in the chair near the bed rather than continuing to pace. "What did you expect?" Ilara asked. "Someone bitter. Broken, perhaps, after everything you have endured here." He shook his head slowly. "Instead, I find someone sharper than half my advisors, and twice as unwilling to bow to fear, even after a blade nearly found your throat tonight. Fear has never solved anything for me," Ilara said quietly. "It only ever made the waiting worse." Their eyes met, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, the air between them charged with something neither of them dared to name. Ilara felt the same strange pull she had noticed the very first night he walked into the healing wing, stronger now, harder to dismiss as mere curiosity or coincidence. Cale's gaze dropped briefly to her lips before he seemed to catch himself, rising abruptly from the chair and putting careful distance between them. "You should sleep," he said, his voice rougher than before. "I will have guards posted outside your door, and I will not leave the stronghold until I have answers about tonight." He left before she could respond, and Ilara lay back against the unfamiliar pillows, her heart still racing, though the danger had long passed, caught between the lingering fear of the attack and the unfamiliar warmth, still lingering, from the moment they had shared. Sleep, when it finally came, brought no peace. Instead, it brought fragments sharper than any she had experienced before, as though the night's danger had shaken something loose deep within her memory. She saw a woman, with pale hair much like her own, kneeling beside a small child in a garden full of herbs, teaching tiny hands how to press leaves between their fingers to test for healing properties. She saw the same woman later, older, harder, standing before a group of villagers with an expression of fierce protectiveness, speaking words Ilara could not quite hear. And then, unmistakably, she saw fire. The garden burned first, herbs curling into ash within moments, and the woman with pale hair turned, screaming a name Ilara still could not fully grasp, even in the depths of her dream, though she felt certain now, more certain than she had ever felt before, that the name belonged to her, and that the woman calling it had been her mother. Ilara woke gasping, tears streaming down her face, before she even understood why, the guards outside her door shifting at the sound of her distress, though none of them entered. She pressed her palms against her eyes, willing the fragments to solidify into something whole, something she could finally hold on to, rather than watch dissolve like smoke the moment she tried to grasp it. Whatever waited buried in her memory, she understood now, with terrible certainty, it would not stay hidden much longer, and she was no longer entirely certain she was ready for what surfacing might finally reveal. Morning came gray and heavy, rain tapping softly against the narrow window of her new chamber. Ilara had barely risen from bed when a soft knock announced Owen's return, his expression carrying the particular weariness of someone who had not slept at all. "The king wishes you to join him in the lower hall," he said. "The guard who attacked you has agreed to speak, though only in your presence." Ilara's stomach tightened at the request, but she nodded and followed him through corridors still damp with morning chill, past soldiers who watched her more carefully now, their eyes lingering on the faint mark still visible along her collarbone. Word of the attack had clearly spread through the stronghold overnight, and she could feel the shift in how people looked at her, no longer simply curious about the collared healer, but wary now, as though she carried danger with her wherever she walked. The lower hall was colder than the rest of the stronghold, its stone walls unadorned, built for questioning rather than comfort. Cale stood near a heavy wooden chair, where the attacker sat bound, his head bowed, exhaustion and fear evident in the slump of his shoulders. Agnes stood nearby as well, her expression unreadable, while Edmund lingered near the back of the room, arms crossed, watching the proceedings with careful, guarded attention. "Tell her what you told me," Cale said, his voice hard as stone. The guard lifted his head slowly, and when his eyes found Ilara's, something like shame flickered across his face. "I was not sent to kill you," he said, his voice hoarse. "I was paid to bring proof. A lock of hair, a drop of blood, anything that could confirm whether the rumors about your markings were true." "Paid by whom?" Cale demanded. The guard hesitated, glancing nervously toward Edmund before answering. A man who calls himself Victor. He came through the southern villages weeks ago, asking questions about a healer with pale hair and marked hands. He offered enough gold to feed my family for a year, if I brought him proof, before anyone else could claim the reward. Elara felt the blood drain from her face. Reward for what? I do not know, the guard admitted. Only that he seemed desperate to confirm your existence before word spread further. He said something about finishing what should have ended years ago, though I did not understand what he meant by it. The words settled over the room like a shadow, and Elara felt Kale's gaze shift toward her immediately, both of them clearly recognizing the implication buried in the guard's confession. Whoever this Victor was, he had known about the fire, known about the bloodline hunted to apparent extinction, and he intended to finish whatever had been started against her family, long before she ever woke in this stronghold, with no memory of who she truly was. Where can this Victor be found? Kale asked. I do not know, the guard said quickly. He never gave a location. He said he would return for proof once I obtained it, though he never specified when. Kale's jaw tightened, frustration evident in the sharp line of his shoulders, but he said nothing further, gesturing instead for the guards to return the attacker to his cell. Once the room had emptied of everyone but Kale, Agnes, and Elara, the weight of silence pressed heavier than before. This confirms what we feared, Agnes said quietly. Whoever destroyed the Lysaria bloodline all those years ago did not consider their work finished. If they learn for certain that Elara survived, and that her gift remains as powerful as the old records suggest, the danger to her will only grow more urgent. Then we make certain they never learn it from anyone within these walls, Kale said, his voice low and resolute. He turned to Elara, something fierce and protective burning behind his eyes. I will not allow anyone to finish what they started against your family. Not while you remain under my protection. Elara studied him carefully, searching for any hint of the political calculation Edmund clearly suspected lurked behind his sudden dedication to her safety, but she found only quiet, unwavering conviction instead. Whatever this connection between them truly was, whether born of ancient bloodlines or something far simpler and harder to name, she found herself believing him completely, and the realization frightened her almost as much as the attack the night before had. Thank you, she said quietly, though I do not yet understand why my safety matters so deeply to you. Kale's expression softened slightly, though the fierce protectiveness never fully left his eyes. Perhaps understanding will come with time. For now, allow me simply to keep you safe, and trust that my reasons run deeper than politics or old family records. Elara said nothing further, though something warm and unfamiliar settled quietly in her chest, tangled inseparably with the growing dread of a man named Victor moving somewhere beyond these walls, patient and determined to finish a fire that had never truly gone out. The bowl of water slipped from Elara's hands and shattered against the stone floor of the healing wing, the sound echoing through the room as her vision blurred, and the walls around her seemed to tilt sharply sideways. She barely felt Grace, the young healer assigned to assist her that morning, catch her arm before her knees buckled entirely. Elara? Grace's voice sounded distant, muffled, as though speaking from the other side of a thick wall. Elara, what is wrong? But Elara could not answer, could not even properly see the healing wing around her anymore. The world had narrowed to smoke and heat, the same smoke and heat that had haunted the edges of her memory for years, except now, it did not fade the way it always had before. Instead, it sharpened, pulling her deeper, until she was no longer standing in the stronghold at all. She was running through a burning village, small hands clutching the hem of a woman's dress, the same pale-haired woman from her dreams, though now her face was clear, achingly familiar, in a way that made Elara's chest ache with a grief she had never fully understood until this moment. Run, Isolde, the woman shouted, shoving her forward with desperate strength. Do not look back, run to the eastern woods, and do not stop until you reach the river. Isolde, the name struck something deep and unshakable within her, and Elara understood with sudden, overwhelming certainty that this had been her true name once, before the fire took everything else away from her. She saw men moving through the burning village, their faces obscured by shadow and smoke, searching each collapsing home with grim, methodical purpose, calling out to one another in voices too calm for the chaos surrounding them. One voice rose above the rest, cold and commanding, ordering his men to search every cellar, every hidden room, until they found the healer's bloodline and ended it completely. They will not stop until every last one of us is gone, the pale-haired woman said, kneeling briefly to grip Alara's small shoulders, her eyes fierce, despite the tears streaming down her soot-streaked face. You carry the gift stronger than any of us before you, Isolde. You must survive, whatever it costs. Promise me. I promise, young Alara whispered, though even in the memory, she could feel how little she understood the weight of that promise at the time. The woman kissed her forehead once, quickly, then turned and ran back toward the burning heart of the village, toward the sound of screaming, and the cold, commanding voice still calling out orders. Alara ran the opposite direction, small legs carrying her through smoke-filled woods, until her lungs burned, and her vision blurred, until finally, mercifully, everything went dark. Alara. The voice pulled her sharply back to the present, and she gasped, blinking against sudden bright torchlight, Cale's face hovering close above hers, his expression carved from pure fear. She realized she was lying on the stone floor of the healing wing, Grace kneeling beside her with tears in her own eyes. Several other healers gathered nervously nearby. What happened? Cale demanded, though his voice carried more concern than command. She simply collapsed, Grace said quickly. One moment she was working, the next she was on the ground, murmuring words I could not understand. What words? Cale asked, turning his attention back to Alara, who was slowly pushing herself upright, despite the lingering dizziness clouding her vision. A name, Alara whispered, her voice hoarse. She kept saying a name, over and over. Isolde. Cale went very still, and Alara watched something shift behind his eyes, recognition dawning slowly, mixed with an urgency she had not seen from him before. Isolde was the name given to the eldest daughter of the Lysaceria bloodline, in the generation before mine, he said quietly. My father spoke of it once, dismissively, as though it were nothing more than an old legend passed down through dying records. I never imagined I would hear it spoken aloud by the very person it belonged to. Alara's hands trembled as the full weight of the memory settled over her. I remember now, she said. Not everything, but enough. My mother called me Isolde. We lived in a village east of here, though I could not tell you where exactly. Men came, searching for us specifically, searching for the healers. She told me to run, and I did, and I never saw her again. Tears slipped silently down her face, years of buried grief finally finding release now that the memory had surfaced fully enough to grieve. Cale knelt beside her without hesitation, pulling her gently against him, and for once, Alara did not resist the comfort he offered, too exhausted and overwhelmed to maintain the careful distance she usually kept between herself and everyone around her. You are safe now, he murmured against her hair. Whatever happened that night, whoever hunted your family, they will not finish what they started, I swear it. They remained like that for several long moments, the healing wing quiet around them, until Alara finally pulled back enough to look up at him, questions burning behind her eyes, despite the exhaustion weighing down every part of her. The voice I heard in my memory, she said slowly, cold, commanding, ordering his men to search every home. Do you think that could have been this man, Victor, the same one who paid the guard to attack me? Cale's expression darkened. It is possible, perhaps even likely. If Victor has spent years searching for survivors of that night, he may have been the one who led the attack against your village in the first place. Then he already knows I might still be alive, Alara said, the realization settling cold and heavy in her stomach. He has known, perhaps, since he first sent someone searching for a healer matching my description. Which means he will not stop searching, now that his suspicions have been partially confirmed, Cale said grimly. We need to understand exactly what he is after, and why he waited this long to act, if he has known about your survival for any length of time. Agnes arrived moments later, alerted by a nervous young healer who had run to fetch her the moment Alara collapsed, and listened with grave attention as Cale relayed everything Alara had remembered. Her expression grew increasingly troubled as the story unfolded, until finally she spoke, her voice heavy with old knowledge she had clearly kept hidden for years. There are records, she said slowly, older than the ones in the king's study, kept separately by the healers themselves, detailing not just the Lysaceria bloodline, but the reasons someone might wish to see it destroyed entirely. I did not think it wise to share them, until we understood more clearly what we were dealing with. But now, I believe we no longer have the luxury of caution. Show us, Kale said immediately. Agnes nodded and gestured for them to follow her deeper into the healing wing, toward a locked door Ilara had never noticed before, hidden behind shelves of dried herbs and old medicine jars. As Agnes retrieved a small key from beneath her robes, Ilara felt her heart pound with a mixture of dread and desperate hope, sensing that whatever waited beyond that door would finally explain not just who she had been before the fire, but why an entire bloodline had been hunted to what everyone believed was complete extinction. The small room beyond the door smelled of dust and dried lavender, shelves lined with journals bound in cracked leather, each one labeled with careful, faded handwriting. Agnes moved with practiced familiarity, running her fingers along the spines until she found the one she wanted, a thin volume near the very back of the highest shelf. "My mother kept these," Agnes said, setting the journal carefully on a small wooden table in the center of the room. "She was healer here before me, and her mother before her, each one passing down whatever fragments of knowledge they gathered about the Lysaria bloodline, though much of it reads more like rumor than fact." She opened the journal to a page marked with a faded ribbon, and Ilara leaned close, her breath catching as she recognized the same symbol from Kale's book, the intertwined hands with the crescent moon and stars, drawn here in far more careful detail, alongside pages of dense, looping handwriting. "The Lysaria were never simply healers," Agnes read aloud, her voice steady, despite the weight of the words. "Their gift extended beyond mending flesh and bone. In moments of great need, their blood could be shared with a bonded alpha, granting him strength beyond his own nature, protection beyond ordinary healing, at great cost to the healer herself. It was this power, more than any other, that made the bloodline both treasured and feared." "Feared by whom?" Kale asked. Agnes turned the page, her expression grim. "By those who believed such power, if claimed by the wrong alpha, could make him unstoppable. There were whispers, generations ago, of an alpha from a rival territory who sought to claim a Lysaria healer for himself, not out of any bond freely given, but through force, intending to use her gift to strengthen his own claim over neighboring lands. When the Lysaria refused to be used as a weapon, this rival alpha ordered their destruction instead, reasoning that if he could not possess their power, no one else should either." Ilara felt sick, the weight of generations of violence pressing down on her chest, as though it were her own memory, rather than one recorded by someone else's careful hand. "You believe this victor might be connected to that same rival territory?" "It is possible," Agnes said. "Perhaps a descendant, or someone who inherited the same ambition, alongside old, bitter grudges. If he learned that a Lysaria healer survived after all these years, and if he understands even a fraction of what your gift is capable of, he will not simply wish to eliminate you anymore. He may wish to capture you instead, and force from you exactly what your ancestors refused to give freely." The thought sent a fresh wave of fear through Ilara, colder and sharper than anything she had felt since waking on the healing wing floor. Kale's hand found hers without hesitation, his grip firm and grounding, and when she looked up at him, she found no trace of doubt in his expression, only fierce, unwavering resolve. "He will not have the chance," Kale said. "Whatever power your bloodline carries, whatever ancient bond exists between the Lysaria and the Ravenwood line, I will not allow it to become a weapon used against your will, by him or by anyone else. You are not a prize to be claimed, Ilara. You are your own, and you will remain your own for as long as I have any say in the matter." Ilara studied his face carefully, searching for any hint of the same possessive ambition Agnes had just described belonging to Victor's ancestor, but she found only quiet, steady conviction instead, the same conviction she had glimpsed the night he removed her from harm's way after the attack in her chamber. "Thank you," she said softly, though the words felt inadequate for everything he had offered her since the moment he first walked into the healing wing. Agnes closed the journal gently, though her expression remained troubled. "There is one more thing you should know before we leave this room. The old records suggest the bond between a Lysaria healer and her alpha, once fully awakened, cannot easily be broken or hidden. If your bond with Kale continues to strengthen, as it appears to be doing already, Victor and anyone working alongside him will have little difficulty sensing it, wherever they may be searching. Meaning the closer Kale and I become," Ilara said slowly, "the easier it will be for Victor to find us." "Meaning exactly that," Agnes confirmed, "which is why I believe our time to prepare, whatever preparation might look like, is far shorter than any of us would prefer. Cale's jaw tightened at the warning, though his grip on Alara's hand did not loosen. Then we prepare quickly, and we prepare well. I will not abandon this bond simply because it makes us easier to find. I would rather face Victor with the full strength of what we might become together, than hide from him while pretending nothing has changed between us. Alara said nothing, though something warm and resolute settled deep within her chest, despite the fear still coiled tightly around it. Whatever waited ahead, whatever cost this awakening bond might eventually demand from her, she found herself believing, perhaps for the first time since the fire took everything else from her, that she would not have to face it entirely alone. "Hand her over." Edmund's voice rang sharp and cold across the council chamber, silencing the murmured conversations that had filled the room only moments before. Alara stood near the wall, close enough to hear every word, though she had not been invited to sit among the advisors gathered around the long table, and her stomach dropped at the venom in Edmund's tone. "You cannot be serious," Cale said, his voice dangerously quiet, the kind of quiet that made seasoned warriors take an involuntary step backward. "I am entirely serious," Edmund said, rising from his seat, his eyes sweeping across the other advisors, as though seeking allies among them. "A man named Victor has already sent someone to attack her within these very walls. Traitors have appeared at our gates asking after her by description. If word continues to spread that we harbor the last of the Lasaria bloodline, we invite war upon ourselves, a war we are not prepared to fight over one healer's bloodline, however rare her gift might be." "She is not simply one healer," Cale said, his voice rising slightly despite his obvious effort to remain controlled. "She may be bonded to this pack by blood, older than any of us sitting in this room. Abandoning her now would be abandoning our own history, our own strength." "Strength does not matter, if we are all dead before we can use it," Edmund shot back. "I have served this pack faithfully for 20 years, through your father's reign, and now through yours. I am not suggesting we harm her. I am suggesting we send her far from here, somewhere Victor's forces will not think to look, before her presence draws destruction down upon everyone within these walls." A murmur rippled through the other advisors, some nodding slowly at Edmund's words, others glancing nervously toward Cale, clearly torn between loyalty to their new king and genuine fear of the danger Edmund described. Alara felt the weight of their stares pressing against her, and for a moment, the old fear of being nothing more than a burden, a problem to be solved rather than a person to be protected, threatened to overwhelm her entirely. "I will not send her away," Cale said finally, his voice carrying absolute finality. "Not to appease fear, and not to avoid a conflict that may come regardless of where she hides. If Victor wishes to threaten this pack over her bloodline, he will find that threatening her means threatening me directly, and I do not intend to make that mistake easy for him." Edmund's jaw tightened, frustration evident in the sharp line of his shoulders, but he said nothing further, sitting back down with visible reluctance, as the rest of the council shifted uncomfortably in the tense silence that followed. Cale dismissed the meeting shortly after, and the advisors filed out slowly, several of them casting uncertain glances toward Alara as they passed. She caught Edmund's eye briefly before he left, and what she saw there chilled her far more than his earlier words had. It was not simply frustration or fear for the pack's safety. It was calculation, cold and deliberate, the look of a man already planning his next move, regardless of what his king had just decided. That night, unable to sleep despite the exhaustion weighing on her from the day's events, Alara wandered toward the small garden tucked behind the healing wing, hoping the cool night air might quiet the restless thoughts circling through her mind. She had not gone far before she noticed movement near the outer wall, two figures speaking low enough that she nearly missed them entirely. She recognized Edmund immediately by his thin silhouette, though the second figure remained hidden beneath a heavy hooded cloak, their face obscured entirely from view. Alara pressed herself against the shadow of a stone pillar, straining to catch fragments of their conversation, carried faintly on the night breeze. "Cannot protect her forever," Edmund was saying, his voice tense. "The king grows more attached with each passing day. If Victor moves too slowly, the bond between them may strengthen beyond anything we can still control." The hooded figure said something too quiet for Alara to catch, and Edmund's response sent ice through her veins. "Tell him the southern patrols will be thinner within the week. If he wishes to move against the stronghold directly, that will be his best opportunity." Alara's breath caught in her throat, and she must have shifted slightly against the pillar, because Edmund's head turned sharply toward the shadows, his eyes narrowing. She held perfectly still, praying the darkness concealed her fully, until finally he turned back toward the hooded figure, exchanging a few final words before the stranger disappeared into the night beyond the wall. Edmund lingered a moment longer, glancing once more toward the shadows where Alara hid, before finally retreating back toward the stronghold. Alara remained frozen against the pillar for several long minutes after he vanished, her heart pounding so loudly, she felt certain it could be heard across the entire garden. Edmund was the traitor. Edmund, the king's own trusted advisor, was passing information directly to Victor, weakening the stronghold's defenses from within, while publicly arguing for her removal under the guise of protecting the pack. The realization left her shaking, uncertain whether to rush immediately to Kale or to gather more proof first, terrified that accusing Edmund without solid evidence might only give him time to cover his tracks more carefully. She made her decision quickly, hurrying back through the stronghold's dim corridors toward Kale's private quarters, her bare feet silent against the cold stone floor. She found him awake, despite the late hour, standing near the window of his chamber, staring out at the dark shape of the mountains, just as he had the very first night she noticed him doing so. "Kale," she said breathlessly, and he turned immediately, alarm flashing across his face at her obvious distress. "What happened?" "Edmund," she said, forcing the words out despite her racing heart. "I saw him in the garden, speaking with someone hooded, someone I could not see clearly. He mentioned Victor by name. He said the southern patrols would be thinner within the week, that it would be Victor's best chance to move against the stronghold." Kale's expression darkened instantly, fury and betrayal warring visibly across his features. "You are certain it was him?" "Absolutely certain," Alara said. "I heard his voice clearly. There is no mistake." Kale was silent for a long moment, his jaw working, as he processed the depth of the betrayal. A man he had trusted since childhood, now revealed as an enemy, working against everything he was trying to protect. Finally, he moved toward the door, his expression hardening into something cold and resolute. "Then we will not wait for Victor to choose his moment," he said. "We will choose ours instead, before Edmund has any further opportunity to weaken our defenses. Come with me. It is time the entire court understood exactly what kind of threat truly stands among us." They found Edmund still awake in his own quarters, seated at his desk with a cup of untouched wine before him, his expression shifting from surprise to guarded calm the moment Kale entered without knocking. Owen followed close behind, along with 2 additional guards Kale trusted beyond question, their presence making clear this was no ordinary visit. "My king," Edmund said carefully, rising slowly from his chair. "This is a late hour for a visit." "Sit down," Kale said, his voice dangerously flat. Edmund's eyes flicked briefly toward Alara, standing just behind Kale's shoulder, and something in his expression tightened, the calculation she had noticed earlier resurfacing, despite his obvious effort to maintain composure. He lowered himself back into his chair slowly, though his hands remained visible atop the desk, careful and deliberate. "I do not understand," he said. "Have I done something to offend you, my king?" "The healer saw you in the garden tonight," Kale said, speaking with a hooded stranger, about weakening the southern patrols. "She heard you mention a man named Victor by name." For a brief moment, something flickered across Edmund's face, quick enough that anyone not watching closely might have missed it entirely. Fear, sharp and unmistakable, followed almost immediately by a mask of wounded indignation sliding back into place. "This is absurd," Edmund said, his voice rising with practiced outrage. "I have served this pack faithfully for 20 years. Whatever the healer believes she overheard, she is clearly mistaken. Or perhaps she seeks to discredit me after our disagreement in council today." "I know what I heard," Alara said, stepping forward, despite the tremor still lingering in her voice. "I know your voice, Edmund. There was no mistake." Edmund's gaze snapped toward her, cold and sharp beneath the surface of his indignation, and for a moment, Alara saw clearly the calculation of a man, deciding whether continued denial would serve him better than open confrontation. He chose denial, rising again from his chair with renewed indignation. "You would take the word of a captive Omega over 20 years of loyal service?" he demanded, turning back toward Kale. "This is exactly the danger I warned the council about. She has clearly poisoned your judgment with whatever strange bond your bloodlines share, and now you would accuse your own advisor, based on nothing more than her word alone." Kale's expression did not waver. "I would take her word over yours, Edmund, because I have watched her risk her own safety, time and again, to protect people who have never shown her a single kindness in return. I have not seen the same from you, not once, in all the years I have known you." Edmund's composure cracked slightly at that, frustration bleeding through the careful mask he had maintained. "You are making a grave mistake." "Perhaps," Kale said. "Or perhaps I am finally seeing clearly what has been hidden beneath your counsel for longer than I realized. Guards, place him under confinement until we can verify the healer's account fully. If she is mistaken, he will be released with a full apology. If she is not, he will answer for treason against this pack." Edmund's protest continued as the guards moved to restrain him, his voice rising with increasingly desperate denials, but Kale turned away without further response, guiding Alara gently from the room as Owen and the guards handled the rest. Once they were alone in the corridor outside, Alara let out a shaky breath she had not realized she was holding. "Do you believe I am right about him?" she asked quietly. "I believe you," Kale said without hesitation. And even setting aside everything else, his reaction just now confirmed it clearly enough. An innocent man accused wrongly grows angry, confused, hurt. Edmund grew calculating. He was already planning his next move before he finished denying the first. Alara nodded slowly, though unease still churned in her stomach. If he was already in contact with Victor, and if he warned him about thinning patrols, do you think Victor might move against us sooner than we expect, now that Edmund has been confined and can no longer report back? Kale's expression turned grim, the same realization clearly settling over him as well. It is possible that Victor is already watching for exactly this kind of disruption, and that silence from Edmund will only confirm his plans have been discovered. We must prepare for the possibility that he moves against us far sooner than any of us are ready for. He looked down at her then, something fierce and determined burning behind his eyes, despite the danger clearly gathering around them both. "Whatever comes next, know that I do not regret a single choice that has led us here. Not the collar I intend to remove from your wrist, not the bond growing between us despite the danger it invites, and not the decision to trust you completely, even against the counsel of a man I once considered a friend." Alara felt something steady settle within her, despite the fear still coiled tightly in her chest. A quiet certainty that whatever Victor intended to bring against the stronghold, she would not face it as a forgotten captive any longer, but as someone finally remembering exactly who she had always been meant to become. A horn blast shattered the early morning quiet, 3 sharp notes that every soul in the stronghold recognized instantly as a warning of approaching danger. Alara jolted upright in bed, her heart already racing before her mind fully caught up with what the sound meant, and within moments, Owen was pounding on her door, his voice tight with urgency. "Scouts spotted movement along the southern ridge," he said, the moment she opened the door. "A large force, moving fast, closer than any patrol should have allowed without warning." "Victor," Alara breathed. "The king believes so," Owen said. "He wants you in the Great Hall immediately." Alara dressed quickly, her hands trembling as she fastened the simple healer's robes she had worn every day for years, though today they felt different against her skin, heavier somehow, weighted with everything she now understood about the bloodline she carried. She followed Owen through corridors filled with hurried movement, soldiers pulling on armor, servants rushing supplies toward the walls, the entire stronghold transforming into something braced for conflict within the space of a single alarm. The great hall was already crowded when she arrived, Kale standing at the head of the long table with maps spread before him, Agnes at his side along with several senior warriors, Alara recognized vaguely from the healing wing. Kale looked up the moment she entered, and something in his expression eased slightly, despite the tension radiating from every line of his body. "How large is the force?" he asked, the moment a scout finished delivering his latest report. "Difficult to say precisely from this distance," the scout answered, "but large enough that our southern patrols would stand little chance if they attempted to hold the ridge alone. Perhaps 200, possibly more, moving with clear purpose toward the stronghold, rather than simply passing through the territory." "Banners?" Kale asked. "None visible," the scout said. "They move without markings, which suggests they do not wish to be identified easily, or that they represent no single recognized territory at all." Kale's jaw tightened, and Alara understood immediately what that meant. Victor was not leading an army from any legitimate pack or territory. He was leading something else entirely, mercenaries perhaps, or hunters gathered specifically for this single purpose, unbound by the usual codes that governed conflicts between packs. "We cannot allow them to reach the stronghold walls," one of the senior warriors said. "If they breach the outer defenses, the healing wing and the eastern quarters will be exposed almost immediately." "Then we do not wait for them to reach the walls," Cale said, his voice carrying the same cold resolve Ilara had heard the night they confronted Edmund. "We meet them on the southern ridge instead, on ground we choose, rather than ground they force upon us." Agnes stepped forward then, her expression grave. "My king, if this force truly serves Victor, and if Victor understands even a portion of what Ilara's bloodline is capable of, he may attempt to bypass your warriors entirely and send a smaller group directly toward the healing wing, hoping to capture her amid the chaos of a larger battle." Cale's gaze flicked toward Ilara, something protective and fierce flaring behind his eyes. "Then we ensure she is never left unguarded, not for a single moment, regardless of where the fighting occurs. I do not wish to hide while others fight because of me," Ilara said, stepping forward despite the nervous glances several warriors exchanged at her boldness. "If my bloodline is truly the reason this force marches toward your walls, then I should stand with you, not cower somewhere safe while others bleed in my place." "Absolutely not," Cale said immediately. "Your gift heals. It does not shield you from a blade or an arrow. I will not risk losing you to prove a point about bravery. And I will not sit quietly while people die defending a secret I only just learned myself," Ilara shot back, her voice rising with an intensity that surprised even herself. "Let me help in the healing wing, at the very least, close enough to tend the wounded as they fall back, rather than locked away somewhere entirely separate from the danger everyone else faces." Cale studied her for a long moment, frustration and reluctant respect warring visibly across his features, before finally exhaling sharply. "The healing wing, then, with guards posted at every entrance, and you do not leave it under any circumstances until I come for you myself. Agreed?" "Agreed," Ilara said, relief mixing with the fear still coiling tight in her chest. The following hours passed in a blur of preparation, soldiers gathering weapons and armor, the healing wing transformed into an organized battlefield hospital, with clean water, bandages, and herbs laid out in careful rows. Ilara worked alongside Grace and several other healers, her hands steady despite the fear thrumming beneath her calm exterior, grateful for the familiar rhythm of preparation to keep her mind from spiraling too far into worry. Cale found her briefly before he rode out with his warriors, his expression softer than the commanding mask he had worn throughout the morning's preparations. He said nothing at first, simply reaching out to brush his knuckles gently against her cheek, a small gesture that carried more weight than any words could have offered. "Stay safe," he said finally. "You as well," Ilara replied, her voice steadier than she felt. He hesitated a moment longer, as though there were something else he wished to say, before finally turning and striding out toward the courtyard where his warriors waited, mounted and ready. Ilara watched from the healing wing entrance as the gates opened and the small army rode out toward the southern ridge, dust rising behind them in the pale morning light, and she pressed her palm against the cool stone wall beside her, whispering a silent prayer to whatever ancestors watched over the Lysaria bloodline, that this day would not end the way that fire so many years ago had. The waiting proved almost worse than the battle itself, once distant sounds of conflict began drifting faintly toward the stronghold walls, carried on the wind alongside the acrid scent of smoke rising somewhere beyond the southern ridge. Ilara forced herself to focus on preparation rather than fear, checking supplies again and again, though her mind kept drifting toward the ridge where Cale now fought against an enemy who had already proven willing to attack her within her own chamber walls. It was nearly midday when the first wounded began arriving, carried on makeshift stretchers by soldiers whose faces carried the particular exhaustion of men who had seen far too much violence in too short a span of time. Ilara moved immediately into action, her hands finding wounds and mending them with practiced efficiency, grateful beyond words for the gift that finally felt less like a burden and more like exactly what she had always been meant to offer. A young soldier grabbed her arm as she finished tending his companion, his expression urgent despite the pain evident on his face. "The king," he said breathlessly. He fought his way toward their leader directly, trying to end this before it spread further. "The last I saw, they were locked in combat near the ridge's edge. and I do not know how it ended." Ilara's blood ran cold, her hands stilling mid-motion as fear threatened to overwhelm every ounce of composure she had managed to maintain throughout the long, tense morning. Whatever was happening on that ridge, whatever the outcome of Kale's confrontation with the man who had hunted her family to near extinction, she understood, with sudden, desperate clarity, that she could not simply wait within these walls any longer. Guard posted or not, agreement made or not, while the man she had come to care for, more deeply than she dared admit, faced Victor alone. She made her decision within seconds, grabbing a small satchel of healing supplies and pressing it into Grace's hands, along with hurried instructions for the wounded still arriving steadily from the ridge. "Where are you going?" Grace asked, alarm evident in her wide eyes. "To the ridge," Ilara said. "I cannot simply stand here while he faces Victor alone." "The king ordered you to remain here," Grace protested. "He will be furious if he learns you left the healing wing." "He can be as furious as he wishes, provided he survives long enough to express it," Ilara said, already moving toward the healing wing's side entrance, where fewer guards had been posted, most of them having been called toward the main gate to manage the flow of wounded soldiers. She slipped past the distracted guards with practiced quiet, years of moving carefully through a stronghold that had never fully trusted her now serving her well, as she made her way toward the stables. A young stable hand recognized her immediately, his eyes widening with concern. "You should not be out here," he said. "The king said." "I know what he said," Ilara interrupted. "But I need a horse, now, and I do not have time to explain further." Something in her expression must have convinced him, because he moved quickly to saddle a gray mare, helping her mount, despite his obvious reluctance. Ilara had ridden only rarely during her years of captivity, but the motion came back to her with surprising ease, as though some distant memory of childhood horseback rides through the eastern woods still lingered somewhere within her. She rode hard toward the southern ridge, the sounds of distant conflict growing louder with each passing moment, smoke thickening in the air, until she could taste it faintly on her tongue, an unwelcome echo of the fire that had haunted her memory for years. When she finally crested a small rise overlooking the battle below, her breath caught at the chaos spread across the valley, warriors locked in combat scattered among the rocks and scrub brush, the metallic clash of weapons ringing out alongside shouts and cries she forced herself not to dwell on too closely. She spotted Kale almost immediately, his distinctive dark armor visible near the center of the fighting, locked in combat, with a broad-shouldered man, whose movements carried the same cold, calculated precision the guard had described hearing in that commanding voice from Ilara's memory of the fire. Victor. It had to be him. Ilara's heart pounded as she watched the two men circle each other, Kale's movements sharp and controlled despite clear exhaustion from hours of fighting. Victor's expression twisted with something that looked disturbingly like satisfaction, as though this confrontation were exactly what he had hoped to achieve all along. She urged her horse forward, weaving carefully around the edges of the fighting, searching for any way to reach Kale's side without simply throwing herself into the heart of the conflict. A soldier grabbed her horse's bridle before she had gone far, his face grim beneath a streak of dirt and blood. "You cannot be here," he said urgently. "The king will have my head if anything happens to you." "Let go," Ilara said, though her attention remained fixed on the distant clash between Kale and Victor. "I need to reach him." "You need to stay back," the soldier insisted, pulling her horse toward a cluster of rocks, offering some measure of shelter from the worst of the fighting. "The healing wing needs you alive, far more than the battlefield needs you dead." Ilara reluctantly allowed herself to be guided toward the rocks, though her eyes never left the distant fight, dread coiling tighter in her stomach with every passing second, as Victor's blade came dangerously close to finding its mark against Kale's side. She pressed her palms together, some instinct deep within her urging her to reach toward him despite the distance separating them, and for a moment, impossibly, she felt something warm and electric surge through her hands, the same sensation she felt each time she healed a wound, except now there was no injury before her to mend, only distance and fear, and a desperate wish for Kale's safety that seemed to pull at something ancient buried deep within her blood. Across the valley, she watched Kale's movements suddenly sharpen, his exhaustion seeming to lift for just a moment as he drove Victor backward with renewed strength, and though she could not be certain, she felt an unmistakable, undeniable connection stretching between them in that instant, as though her desperate hope had somehow reached across the battlefield and lent him exactly the strength he needed most. Then Victor stumbled, and Kale's blade found its mark, and the broad-shouldered man who had haunted her family's fate for years finally fell to the rocky ground of the southern ridge, unmoving. The remaining fighters scattered almost immediately, Victor's unmarked mercenaries breaking formation and fleeing without their leader to command them, and a ragged cheer rose from Kale's warriors as the battle's outcome became suddenly, overwhelmingly clear. Ilara's breath left her in a rush of relief so intense her vision blurred slightly, and she urged her horse forward again, no longer willing to wait at the edge of the fighting now that the danger had clearly broken. She reached Kale just as he turned from Victor's fallen form, his expression shifting rapidly, from exhausted relief to stunned disbelief, the moment he spotted her approaching on horseback. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, though relief colored his voice far more than the anger his words suggested. "I could not simply wait," Ilara said, dismounting quickly, despite her trembling legs. "I am sorry I disobeyed you, but I could not stay behind those walls, not knowing whether you would return to me." Kale closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, pulling her against him with a fierceness that stole the breath from her lungs entirely. "You are impossible," he murmured against her hair, though his tone carried far more affection than frustration. "Reckless and impossible, and I do not think I have ever been more grateful for anything in my entire life than seeing you appear on that ridge." Ilara pulled back just enough to look up at him, relief and lingering fear tangled together in her chest. "Is it truly over? Was that Victor?" Kale's expression sobered slightly as he glanced back toward the fallen man. "It was, though I fear this may only be the beginning of understanding exactly how far his reach extended before today, and how many others may still carry forward whatever ambitions he held regarding your bloodline." Ilara nodded slowly, the weight of his words settling over the relief of the moment, and together they turned back toward the stronghold, the scattered remnants of Victor's mercenaries fleeing into the distance behind them, leaving behind a battlefield finally quiet after a fear that had haunted her entire remembered life. Edmund's laughter echoed harshly off the stone walls of the confinement cell, a sound so unexpected that the guard standing watch outside took an involuntary step backward. "You think this ends with Victor's death?" Edmund said, his voice carrying a bitter edge that had replaced his earlier calculated calm entirely, now that his schemes had unraveled beyond recovery. "You have only removed one piece from a board, far larger than you understand." Kale stood just outside the cell bars, his expression carved from cold stone, Ilara close beside him, though she remained silent, watching Edmund's face carefully for any hint of the truth buried beneath his bitterness. Word of Victor's death had spread quickly through the stronghold the moment the warriors returned from the southern ridge, and Kale had wasted no time demanding answers from the advisor whose betrayal had nearly cost them everything. "Explain," Kale said, his voice offering no room for further games. Edmund studied him for a long moment, calculating even now, before something like resignation finally settled over his features. Victor was never acting alone. He served a man far more dangerous, an Alpha King from the Western Territories named Garrick, who has spent decades quietly rebuilding influence lost when his ancestor first ordered the Lysaria bloodline destroyed generations ago. Ilara's breath caught sharply. The rival Alpha from the old records. The one who wanted to claim a Lysaria healer for himself. His descendant, Edmund confirmed, his gaze flicking toward her, with something that almost resembled reluctant respect. Garrick believes, reclaiming that old ambition would secure his territory's dominance over every neighboring pack, yours included. Victor served as his agent, tasked with confirming whether any survivors of that bloodline still existed. Once confirmation seemed likely, Garrick intended to move directly, using whatever force necessary to claim what his ancestor failed to claim generations ago. "And you agreed to help him," Kale said, disgust evident in every word. "Garrick offered wealth and position beyond anything this pack could ever provide me," Edmund said, though his voice lacked the conviction to make the admission sound anything but hollow. "I did not believe the healer's bloodline was worth the risk of war you seemed so determined to invite by protecting her. I still do not believe it, though I recognize now that my judgment on the matter no longer holds any weight within these walls." Kale's jaw tightened, fury and old, betrayed friendship warring behind his controlled expression. "You will remain confined until I determine an appropriate judgment for your treason." Do not expect leniency simply because Victor is already dead and cannot answer for his own crimes. He turned away without waiting for Edmund's response, guiding Alara firmly by the elbow as they walked back through the stronghold's corridors, the weight of this new revelation settling heavily over both of them despite the relief of surviving the morning's battle. Garrick will not simply abandon his ambitions because Victor failed, Alara said quietly, once they were beyond earshot of the confinement cells. No, Cale agreed. If anything, Victor's death will likely accelerate whatever plans Garrick still holds. He will understand now that subtlety has failed, and men who favor ambition over patience rarely respond to failure with restraint. They walked in tense silence for several long moments before Cale stopped abruptly, turning to face her fully in the quiet corridor. There is something I wish to do before Garrick or anyone else moves against us again. Something I should have done the moment I understood who you truly are. He reached for her wrist gently, and Alara realized with a start that he meant the thin, worn collar still fastened there, the same collar she had worn for years as a mark of her captivity within these very walls. Cale produced a small key from beneath his tunic, one she had never seen before, and carefully fitted into the collar's hidden lock. I do not want this removed quietly, in some private corridor where no one witnesses it, he said. I want the entire court to see it, to understand clearly that you are no longer a captive within these walls, but someone under my full protection and respect, regardless of what any advisor or rival alpha believes about the wisdom of that choice. Alara's throat tightened with emotion she had not expected, years of captivity suddenly feeling both impossibly long and strangely fragile in the face of his quiet determination. Cale, let me do this properly, he said gently. Please. She nodded, unable to trust her voice fully, and together they made their way toward the great hall, where word had already spread that the king wished to address the entire court following the morning's battle. The hall filled quickly, warriors still bearing the marks of combat standing alongside advisors and servants, all of them murmuring curiously, as Cale led Alara to stand beside him at the head of the room. Today this pack faced an enemy, who believed our history and our bloodlines mattered less than his own ambition, Cale said, his voice carrying clearly across the crowded hall. We proved him wrong, at great cost, though the danger he represented has not fully passed. The woman beside me is not simply a healer who happened to serve within these walls. She is the last known survivor of the Lasaria bloodline, bonded to this pack by blood and history, far older than any of us standing here today. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some expressions shifting toward wonder, others toward unease, though none dared voice their doubts openly in the face of Cale's evident conviction. He turned to Alara then, and with deliberate, unhurried motion, removed the collar from her wrist entirely, letting it fall to the stone floor, with a soft, final clatter that echoed through the silent hall. She is under my protection, as an equal within this pack, not as a prisoner, and not as a tool to be used against our enemies, Cale continued, his gaze sweeping across the gathered court. Anyone who challenges that protection challenges me directly. Silence held the hall for a long moment before scattered applause began, hesitant at first, then growing stronger as warriors who had fought beside Cale that very morning added their voices to the moment. Alara stood frozen, tears slipping silently down her face, the weight of years finally lifting from her wrist and settling instead into something that felt remarkably, impossibly like belonging. Later that evening, as the stronghold slowly settled from the day's chaos, Alara found herself standing once again in the small garden behind the healing wing, the same garden where she had overheard Edmund's betrayal only nights before. The night air felt different now, lighter somehow, though the looming threat of Garrick still lingered at the edges of her relief. Cale found her there, his expression softer than she had seen it since this entire ordeal began, and he settled beside her on the low stone bench without a word, simply taking her hand in his and holding it gently. Thank you, she said finally, for today, for all of it. You do not need to thank me, Cale said. You have given this pack more courage and hope in the span of a few short days than I believe it has felt in years. I only wish I could promise you that the danger has fully passed. I do not need that promise, Alara said, leaning her head against his shoulder, exhaustion and quiet contentment settling over her in equal measure. I only need to know that whatever comes next I will not face it as someone forgotten any longer. Kale pressed a soft kiss against the top of her head, and for a moment, beneath the darkening sky and the lingering scent of smoke, still clinging faintly to the air from the day's battle, Elara allowed herself simply to feel safe, however briefly that peace might last, before Garrick's shadow finally reached their door. That fragile peace lasted only until morning. Elara woke to the sound of raised voices near the stronghold's main gate, and she dressed quickly, hurrying toward the commotion with her heart already sinking in anticipation of whatever new trouble had arrived. She found Kale standing near the gate, his expression grim, as he studied a rolled parchment sealed with unfamiliar dark wax. A single messenger, standing nervously a short distance away, under the watchful eyes of several guards. "What is it?" Elara asked, joining Kale's side. "A message," Kale said quietly, "from Garrick himself." He broke the seal and unrolled the parchment, his eyes scanning the contents quickly, his jaw tightening with each line he read. Elara waited, watching his expression darken further, until finally, he lowered the parchment enough for her to read it herself. The words were elegant, almost courteous in tone, which somehow made their content all the more unsettling. Garrick expressed polite regret over Victor's death, framing it as an unfortunate misunderstanding between allies who might have negotiated peacefully rather than resorting to violence. He requested, with deceptively gentle phrasing, that the healer known as the last of the Lysaria bloodline be delivered to his territory within a fortnight, in exchange for his continued goodwill and a promise not to pursue the matter through less diplomatic means. "He is asking you to hand me over," Elara said slowly, as though I were property to be traded for peace. "He is not simply asking," Kale said, his voice hard. "He is threatening war, disguised as diplomacy. If we refuse, and I intend to refuse completely, he will use our rejection as justification to move against us with far greater force than Victor commanded. Then we prepare for that possibility," Elara said, though fear coiled tightly in her stomach at the thought of facing an entire Alpha King's forces, rather than a single mercenary company. "We cannot give in to threats such as these, no matter how politely worded." Kale studied her for a long moment, something fierce and protective burning behind his eyes, despite the daunting threat now facing them both. "No," he agreed finally. "We will not. Whatever Garrick intends to bring against us, we will face it together, and we will make certain he understands exactly how costly it will be to finish what his ancestor started against your bloodline all those years ago." The messenger, dismissed without a formal response beyond Kale's cold refusal, delivered through Owen, rode away from the stronghold within the hour, and Elara watched him disappear over the horizon, with a growing sense that whatever peace they had claimed after Victor's death would prove painfully short-lived, the true reckoning with her family's ancient enemy still waiting, patient and inevitable, somewhere beyond the mountains that had sheltered her secret for so many years. 2 weeks, Agnes said, her voice tight with urgency, as she spread a worn map across the council table. "That is all the time we have, before Garrick's fortnight expires, and he decides we have refused him permanently." The great hall buzzed with tense activity. Warriors and advisors gathered around the table studying troop positions and supply routes, the entire stronghold shifting into a state of careful, deliberate preparation for a conflict none of them had wanted, but all of them now recognized as unavoidable. Elara stood near the edge of the table, still adjusting to her new place among the gathered leaders, rather than lingering silently at the room's edges as she once had. 2 weeks is not enough time to properly fortify the southern defenses, one of the senior warriors said grimly. "Garrick commands resources far beyond what Victor's mercenaries represented. If he brings his full army, we will be badly outnumbered." "Then we do not rely on numbers alone," Kale said, his gaze shifting toward Elara with quiet intensity. "Agnes, tell them what you told me this morning." Agnes nodded slowly, setting aside the map and retrieving instead a small, worn scroll from beneath her robes, its edges frayed with age. The old records describe a ritual, performed only once in living memory, between a Lysaria healer and her bonded alpha, meant to fully awaken the ancient connection between their bloodlines. If completed properly, it grants the alpha strength and protection beyond his natural ability, drawn directly from the healer's gift, while granting the healer a measure of the alpha's resilience in return. "You believe this ritual could help us against Garrick's forces," Elara said slowly. I believe it may be the difference between facing his army as equals and facing it as a pack, already at a severe disadvantage, Agnes said. But I must warn you both, the ritual is not without cost. The old records suggest it demands complete trust between both parties, a bond freely given, rather than forced, and the process itself is neither simple nor without risk to either of you. Cale turned to Alara fully, searching her face for any hesitation before he spoke. I will not ask this of you without your full willingness. Whatever this ritual requires, it must be your choice alone. Alara considered his words carefully, the weight of the coming conflict pressing against the growing certainty she felt whenever she looked at him. A certainty that had nothing to do with ancient bloodlines, and everything to do with the quiet, steady trust that had grown between them since the very first night he walked into the healing wing. I choose this, she said finally. Not because the old records demand it, but because I trust you, completely, with whatever this bond requires of us both. Agnes nodded, satisfaction and relief evident in her expression. Then we should not delay. The ritual requires privacy, and a night when the moon sits high and full, which fortune has granted us only 2 evenings from now. The 2 days that followed passed in a strange blend of urgent preparation and quiet anticipation, Alara continuing her work in the healing wing during daylight hours, while Cale oversaw the stronghold's defensive preparations, though they found small moments together each evening, sharing quiet conversation that felt increasingly precious given the uncertainty looming ahead. Alara found herself telling him more of the fragments now surfacing steadily from her recovered memory, small details of her childhood before the fire, the sound of her mother's laughter, the particular scent of the herb garden where she had first learned to press leaves between her fingers. Cale listened to each fragment with quiet attention, occasionally sharing pieces of his own past in return. Stories of his father's harsh expectations, the loneliness of growing up as an heir groomed for leadership rather than simply allowed to be a child. Slowly, carefully, they built something between them that felt entirely separate from ancient bloodlines and old prophecies, something that belonged only to the two of them. The night of the ritual arrived clear and cold, the full moon rising high above the stronghold's tallest tower, where Agnes had instructed them to meet. Alara climbed the narrow stairs with her heart pounding, uncertain exactly what to expect, though the steady presence of Cale beside her offered more comfort than she had words to express. Agnes waited at the top, along with a simple ceremonial arrangement of candles and herbs she had gathered specifically for the occasion, their scent sharp and earthy against the cool night air. The ritual is simpler than you might expect, she explained. It requires only a small exchange of blood between you both, offered freely, while you speak words of intention aloud. The bond itself will do the rest, should it choose to fully awaken. She handed Cale a small ceremonial blade, its edge honed to a fine point, and stepped back to allow them privacy despite remaining close enough to guide them if needed. Cale took Alara's hand gently, his eyes searching hers one final time. Are you certain? He asked. I am certain, Alara said, and meant it fully. He drew the blade lightly across his palm, then across her own, the shallow cuts stinging briefly, before Alara's own healing instinct immediately began working to close them. Before the wounds could fully seal, Cale pressed his palm against hers, their blood mingling between joined hands, and he spoke the words Agnes had taught him earlier that day, simple and direct. I offer my strength to protect what you carry, and I ask for your trust in return. Alara felt something shift deep within her chest, warm and electric, spreading outward from their joined hands, until it seemed to fill her entire body with a sensation she could not fully name. She spoke her own words in response, her voice steady, despite the overwhelming sensation building within her. I offer my gift to strengthen what you protect, and I give my trust freely, without reservation. The warmth between them surged suddenly, brighter and more intense, and for a moment, Alara felt as though she could sense Cale's heartbeat as clearly as her own, his exhaustion and worry and fierce protectiveness, all bleeding faintly into her own awareness, in a way that left her breathless. Cale's eyes widened slightly, clearly experiencing something similar from his own side of the bond, and slowly, the intensity settled into something steadier, a quiet, constant awareness of each other, that Alara suspected would never fully fade now that it had been awakened. Agnes studied them both carefully, once the moment passed, satisfaction evident in her weathered expression. The bond has taken hold, she said. You will find your instincts sharper now, your reflexes and awareness heightened whenever you fight alongside each other. And Elara, I suspect you will find your healing gift stronger than ever before, drawing now from a well fed by two bloodlines, rather than one alone. Kale pulled Elara gently against him, relief and something deeper, more tender settling over his features. Whatever Garrick brings against us, he murmured, we will face it as one, in every sense that matters now. Elara rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, now somehow familiar in a way it had not been before, and allowed herself a rare moment of hope, despite the war, gathering steadily on the horizon. That fragile hope lasted only until a scout's urgent voice echoed up from the courtyard below, calling for the king with unmistakable alarm. Kale and Elara exchanged a single glance before hurrying down the narrow stairs together, and the scout's words, once they reached the courtyard, confirmed exactly what both of them had feared since Garrick's message first arrived at their gates. My king, the scout gasped, breathless from his ride. Garrick's army has been spotted 3 days from here, and they march far faster than any of us anticipated. We may have only a handful of days remaining, not the fortnight we believed we still held. The courtyard fell into stunned silence for a brief moment, before Kale's voice cut through it, sharp and commanding. Sound the alarm. I want every warrior armed and positioned within the hour, and I want the healing wing fully prepared to receive wounded before nightfall. The stronghold erupted into organized chaos once again, soldiers rushing toward the armory, servants hurrying to secure supplies and livestock within the inner walls, the entire fortress bracing itself for a conflict that had arrived far sooner than anyone had dared to plan for. Elara felt the newly awakened bond hum faintly within her chest, as she watched Kale issue orders with rapid, decisive clarity, an unfamiliar awareness of his rising urgency bleeding faintly into her own thoughts, despite the physical distance now separating them, as he moved through the courtyard. 3 days, she murmured to Agnes, who had followed them down from the tower with surprising speed despite her age. How is that possible? Garrick's message suggested a fortnight. Perhaps he never intended to honor his own deadline, Agnes said grimly. Or perhaps he learned of the ritual somehow, and wished to strike before the bond between you and Kale could fully strengthen your defenses. Either way, we no longer have the luxury of extended preparation. Elara nodded, forcing down the fear rising steadily in her chest, and turned her attention toward the healing wing, where her own preparations would prove just as vital as the warriors readying their weapons throughout the courtyard. She found Grace already organizing supplies with impressive efficiency, though the younger healer's hands trembled slightly as she worked. 3 days, Grace said quietly, echoing the fear Elara had only just voiced herself. Do you think we are ready? We will be, Elara said, with far more confidence than she entirely felt. We prepared for Victor's smaller force and managed well enough. We simply need to prepare more thoroughly this time, and trust that Kale's warriors, strengthened now by the bond Agnes helped us awaken, will hold the line long enough for our efforts to matter. Grace nodded, steadying herself visibly at Elara's calm reassurance, and the two women returned to their preparations with renewed focus, laying out clean bandages and healing herbs in careful rows, boiling water for cleaning wounds, arranging cots in neat lines along the healing wing's walls to accommodate whatever number of wounded the coming days might bring. As evening settled over the stronghold, Elara found herself once again standing at the healing wing's entrance, watching the courtyard below, where torches now burned steadily against the gathering darkness, warriors moving in disciplined formations as Kale's senior commanders drilled them one final time before the coming conflict. She spotted Kale among them, his dark armor catching the torchlight as he moved from group to group, offering quiet words of encouragement and correction in equal measure. He must have sensed her watching, some faint thread of the newly formed bond alerting him to her attention, because he glanced up toward the healing wing and found her immediately, even across the crowded courtyard. Their eyes held for a long moment, unspoken understanding passing between them despite the distance, before he returned his attention to his warriors, and Elara turned back toward her own preparations, the weight of the coming battle settling heavily over both of them, as the full moon that had witnessed their bonding ritual continued its slow climb across the darkening sky, indifferent to the conflict now gathering rapidly toward their gates. The horizon turned dark with movement long before the first of Garrick's soldiers came within clear sight of the stronghold's walls, a slow, creeping shadow spreading across the southern plains that made every warrior along the battlements fall silent with grim recognition of exactly what they now faced. Alara stood beside Kale, atop the main gate's watchtower, her heart pounding as she watched the distant army continue its steady approach. Banners she did not recognize snapping in the wind above ranks of soldiers, stretching further than she could easily count. The bond between her and Kale hummed steadily beneath her fear, a strange, grounding awareness of his own controlled tension standing solid beside her own. "There are so many," she said quietly. "More than Victor commanded, certainly," Kale agreed, his voice carrying the same careful control Alara had come to recognize whenever he faced overwhelming odds without flinching outwardly from them. "But numbers alone do not win every battle. We have walls, defensible ground, and warriors who understand exactly what they fight to protect." "And Garrick himself?" Alara asked. "Do you believe he rides among them?" "I would wager everything I have that he does," Kale said grimly. A man ambitious enough to pursue a bloodline his ancestor failed to claim generations ago would not entrust something this important to subordinates alone, not after Victor's failure already cost him one attempt. They watched together as the army drew closer, finally halting at a distance just beyond arrow range, and Alara felt her breath catch as a small group of riders broke away from the main force, approaching the stronghold's gates under a banner of parley rather than immediate attack. Kale's expression hardened, and he gestured for Owen to accompany him down toward the gate to meet whatever message Garrick's riders carried. Alara insisted on joining them despite Kale's initial reluctance, and this time he did not argue as fiercely, some unspoken understanding passing between them through the newly awakened bond that her presence might matter more than either of them could fully explain. They met the riders just inside the gate, a broad-shouldered man at their center, whose bearing radiated the particular arrogance of someone accustomed to having his demands met without argument. "Garrick," Kale said, and it was not a question. "King Ravenwood," Garrick replied, his voice smooth and cultured despite the massive army waiting silently behind him. "I had hoped, given time to consider my earlier message, you might have arrived at a wiser decision than the one your continued defiance suggests." "I gave you my answer already," Kale said. "She is not yours to claim, and this pack is not yours to threaten." Garrick's gaze shifted toward Alara then, studying her with an intensity that made her skin crawl, despite her effort to hold his stare without flinching. "Remarkable," he murmured. "My family has searched for a survivor of your bloodline for generations, healer, and here you stand, hiding behind a young king's misplaced chivalry, rather than embracing the destiny your gift was always meant to fulfill." "My destiny is my own to choose," Alara said, her voice steadier than she expected, given the fear coiling tightly in her stomach. "Not yours, and not your ancestors either. Whatever ambition drove him to destroy my family, I will not fulfill it willingly, now or ever." Something flickered across Garrick's expression, irritation quickly smoothed back into practiced calm. "A pity," he said. "I had hoped to avoid unnecessary bloodshed, but it seems your king's stubbornness leaves me little alternative." He turned his horse slightly, addressing Kale directly once more. "You have until dawn to reconsider. Should you continue this defiance, I will take what I came for, regardless of how many of your warriors must fall to secure it." He wheeled his horse without waiting for further response, his small group of riders following him back toward the waiting army, leaving Kale and Alara standing at the gate, with the weight of an ultimatum neither of them had any intention of honoring. "We will not have until dawn," Kale said quietly, once the riders had ridden out of easy earshot. Men like Garrick rarely honor the deadlines they themselves establish, especially once they sense their opponent will not simply capitulate. "Then we prepare for an attack that could come at any moment," Alara said, and Kale nodded grimly in agreement. The stronghold spent the remaining daylight hours in tense, focused preparation, every warrior positioned along the walls, the healing wing fully stocked and ready, Alara moving between the wounded soldiers, already recovering from the skirmish with Victor days before, offering final touches of healing to ensure every able body could return to the walls if needed. She felt the bond with Kale thrumming steadily throughout the day, a constant undercurrent of shared awareness that she found herself relying on more than she expected, a quiet reassurance that he remained close, even when duty kept them physically apart. Night fell heavy and tense over the stronghold, torches burning along every wall, Warriors standing silent watch against the darkness where Garrick's army waited, patient and immense, somewhere beyond the range of clear sight. Elara found herself unable to rest, despite the exhaustion weighing on her, instead climbing once more to the watchtower, where she had first seen Garrick's forces approaching, drawn by some instinct she could not fully name. Cale joined her there sometime past midnight, his own exhaustion evident despite the controlled calm he maintained for the sake of his warriors. They stood together in silence for a long while, watching the distant flicker of enemy campfires dotting the darkness like a field of malevolent stars. "Are you afraid?" Elara asked finally. "Every commander who claims otherwise is either lying or foolish," Cale said. "But fear does not have to control the choices we make. It simply reminds us how much we stand to lose if we choose poorly." Elara leaned against him, drawing comfort from the solid warmth of his presence, the bond between them settling something anxious and restless within her chest. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said quietly, "I am glad it was you I found, after everything the fire took from me all those years ago." Cale turned to face her fully, cupping her face gently between his hands, his expression carrying a tenderness that contrasted sharply with the grim tension of the night surrounding them. "And I am endlessly grateful that a girl the world believed forgotten walked into my healing wing and reminded me exactly what this crown is meant to protect." He kissed her then, soft and unhurried, despite the looming threat gathered just beyond their walls, and Elara allowed herself to simply exist in that single, stolen moment, gathering strength from it, for whatever trial the coming dawn would demand of them both. They did not have to wait for dawn. A horn blast shattered the night's uneasy quiet barely an hour later, followed immediately by the unmistakable roar of an army surging forward under cover of darkness, torches and weapons gleaming as Garrick's forces abandoned any pretense of honoring his own deadline, charging instead toward the stronghold's walls with overwhelming, terrifying speed. Cale was moving before the horn's echo fully faded, shouting orders as he raced down from the watchtower, warriors scrambling into position along the walls with the kind of disciplined speed that spoke to hours of careful preparation. Elara followed close behind, her heart hammering wildly, the bond between them surging with sharp, urgent awareness of Cale's own racing pulse and fierce determination. "Get to the healing wing," Cale said, catching her arm briefly, before they parted ways in the chaos of the courtyard. "Whatever happens, stay there until I come for you." "Be careful," Elara said, though she knew the words were inadequate for the danger he was about to face. He pressed a quick, hard kiss to her forehead, before disappearing into the organized chaos of warriors taking their positions, and Elara forced herself to turn away, hurrying toward the healing wing, where Grace and the other healers were already lighting additional lanterns, bracing for whatever the coming battle would bring through their doors. The sounds of the assault reached them clearly even from within the healing wing's stone walls, the crash of siege equipment against the outer gate, shouts and cries carrying on the night air, the unmistakable clash of weapons meeting weapons in the darkness beyond. Elara worked alongside Grace to prepare the last of their supplies, her hands steady despite the fear thrumming through her chest, made sharper now by the constant, distant awareness of Cale's own battle, unfolding somewhere beyond these walls. The first wounded arrived within the hour, carried in by soldiers whose faces reflected the particular grim focus of men fighting for their home, rather than simply following orders. Elara moved immediately into the familiar rhythm of her gift, hands finding wounds and mending them with practiced efficiency, though she noticed almost immediately that her healing came faster now, stronger, drawing on some deeper well of strength she had not possessed before the bonding ritual atop the tower. "Your gift," Grace said, watching in amazement as a soldier's serious wound closed almost entirely beneath Elara's palms, within moments, rather than the usual slower process. "It has changed." "The bond," Elara said breathlessly, continuing her work without pause. "Agnes said it would strengthen. I did not expect it to feel quite this different." She worked through what felt like hours, wounded soldiers arriving in a steady stream, the sounds of battle beyond the healing wing's walls never fully quieting despite the passage of time. Through it all, the bond with Cale remained a constant, steady thread in the back of her awareness, shifting occasionally with sharp spikes of exertion or danger that made her breath catch, though never once did she sense the kind of overwhelming fear or pain that would have signaled something had gone terribly wrong. Then, abruptly, sometime deep into the night, she felt it. A sudden, sharp jolt of pain lancing through the bond, followed immediately by a wave of dizzying weakness that nearly buckled her own knees, despite standing safely within the healing wing's walls. Kale was hurt, badly, somewhere beyond these walls, and every instinct within her screamed to abandon her post and find him immediately. "Ilara!" Grace's voice sounded distant, alarmed, as she caught Ilara's arm to steady her. "Kale," Ilara gasped. "Something is wrong. I can feel it." She did not wait for permission this time, grabbing her healing satchel and pushing past Grace's protests, racing out of the healing wing into the chaos of the courtyard beyond, desperate to reach the man whose pain now echoed sharply through the bond they had awakened together beneath a full and indifferent moon. Smoke and chaos filled the courtyard as Ilara pushed through retreating soldiers and scattered debris, her eyes searching desperately for any sign of Kale, among the confusion of battle still raging along the outer walls. The bond pulled at her insistently, a thread of pain and weakening strength guiding her steps more surely than her eyes could manage in the darkness and smoke. She found him near the base of the eastern wall, where a section of Garrick's forces had apparently breached through a smaller gate. Kale locked in combat with Garrick himself, while several of his warriors fought desperately to hold back the surrounding enemy soldiers. A gash along Kale's side bled steadily through his armor, his movements noticeably slower than they had been earlier, exhaustion and injury clearly taking their toll despite his continued determination. Ilara's shout tore from her throat before she could stop it, and both men's attention flickered briefly toward her, though Garrick recovered his focus far more quickly, using the momentary distraction to drive Kale backward with a heavy blow that nearly sent him to his knees. "How touching," Garrick sneered, not taking his eyes off Kale even as he addressed her. "The healer arrives to watch her king fall. Perhaps this will finally convince you that resistance only prolongs unnecessary suffering." Ilara's fear crystallized instantly into something harder, sharper, a fierce protectiveness that overrode every instinct telling her to simply hide from the danger surrounding her. She rushed forward despite the soldiers still fighting nearby, dropping to her knees beside Kale the moment Garrick momentarily disengaged to reposition his blade. "Let me help you," she said urgently, pressing her palms against the wound along his side. "You should not be here," Kale gasped, though he did not push her away, his hand covering hers briefly, despite the danger surrounding them both. "I could not stay away," Ilara said, and poured every ounce of her strength into the healing beneath her palms, feeling the bond between them flare brilliantly bright, warmth flooding from her hands into his wound, knitting torn flesh back together, with a speed that made even Garrick pause in evident surprise. But healing alone would not be enough to defeat Garrick, and Ilara understood with sudden, desperate clarity exactly what the old records had hinted at regarding the deeper capabilities of the bond they had awakened. She kept one hand pressed against Kale's healing wound, while reaching for his free hand with the other, meeting his eyes with fierce determination. "Take my strength," she said. "Whatever you need, take it. I trust you completely." Kale hesitated only a moment before understanding flashed across his face, and he gripped her hand firmly, the bond between them surging with sudden, overwhelming intensity that left Ilara gasping, a warm rush of energy flowing from her into him, strengthening muscles already exhausted from hours of relentless combat. She felt her own strength ebb in response, dizzying and disorienting, but she held firm, trusting him exactly as she had promised beneath the full moon 2 nights before. Kale rose to his feet with renewed vigor, his exhaustion visibly lifting as the ancient bond fulfilled exactly the purpose the ritual had been designed for, generations ago, granting him strength drawn directly from her gift. Strength enough to face Garrick as an equal, despite his earlier injuries and fatigue. "This bond will not save you," Garrick snarled, though uncertainty flickered behind his earlier confidence as he watched Kale's stance sharpen and steady. "My ancestor should have finished the Lasseria bloodline completely, rather than allowing even one survivor to escape into hiding." "Your ancestor failed," Kale said, his voice carrying newfound strength despite the wound still healing along his side. "Because some things are not meant to be claimed by force, no matter how desperately ambitious men insist otherwise." He moved before Garrick could respond, his blade meeting Garrick's with renewed speed and precision, the fight between them intensifying rapidly as both men fought with everything they possessed. Ilara remained kneeling nearby, weakened from the exchange but refusing to retreat, watching with her heart in her throat as the two men circled and clashed, the bond between herself and Cale humming steadily even now, offering him whatever small reserves of strength she still carried within her. The fight stretched on, brutal and unrelenting, until finally Garrick made a critical misstep, overextending during a heavy strike, and Cale seized the opening immediately, driving his blade forward with the combined strength of his own training and Alara's freely given gift. Garrick staggered backward, his weapon falling from suddenly weakened fingers, and collapsed to the ground much as Victor had days before, though this time the surrounding soldiers who had served him hesitated visibly, clearly uncertain whether to continue fighting without their commander's leadership. "Your king is defeated," Cale called out to the hesitating soldiers, his voice carrying clearly, despite his exhaustion. "Lay down your weapons, and you may return to your homes unharmed. Continue fighting for a cause already lost, and you will share his fate instead." A long, tense moment passed before the first soldier lowered his weapon, followed quickly by others, the remaining forces surrendering in scattered groups throughout the courtyard, as word spread rapidly of Garrick's defeat. Alara felt relief flood through her so intensely her vision blurred, and she allowed herself finally to sink fully onto the ground, her strength nearly spent from the healing and the bond's demands combined. Cale was at her side instantly, gathering her carefully into his arms, his own relief evident despite the exhaustion etched into every line of his face. "You should not have left the healing wing," he murmured, though his voice held no true reproach, only fierce gratitude. "I could not lose you," Alara said simply, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not after everything we have already survived together." He held her close, as the courtyard slowly settled around them, soldiers moving to secure the surrendered enemy forces, others rushing to tend the wounded, scattered throughout the aftermath of the battle. Grace found them there sometime later, relief flooding her expression at finding Alara alive, despite her weakened state, and together, they helped her back toward the healing wing, where she spent the remainder of the night recovering her strength, while healers and soldiers alike worked to manage the battle's aftermath. The following days passed in a blur of recovery and rebuilding, the stronghold slowly returning to some semblance of normalcy despite the visible scars the battle had left behind. Garrick's surviving soldiers were escorted back toward their own territory under careful guard, along with a clear message that any future ambitions regarding the Lysaria bloodline would be met with the same resolve that had defeated both Victor and Garrick himself. Edmund, upon learning of Garrick's defeat and the collapse of the scheme he had helped enable, offered his confession fully to Cale's council, and though his punishment remained a matter for the Pack's laws to determine, his influence within the stronghold had ended completely and irrevocably. Alara spent much of her recovery in the healing wing, tending to the wounded from the battle, while slowly regaining her own strength, though she found herself rarely alone during those days, Cale visiting whenever his duties allowed, Agnes checking on her progress with evident pride, Grace and the other healers treating her now with genuine warmth, rather than the wary distance that had once defined her years of captivity. 2 weeks after the battle's end, once the stronghold had settled fully into recovery, and the last of the wounded had healed under Alara's careful attention, Cale called the entire court together once more in the Great Hall, much as he had done the day he removed her collar before the assembled crowd. Alara stood beside him now, stronger and more confident than she had ever imagined herself capable of becoming, the fragmented, forgotten girl, who had once believed herself nothing more than a useful captive, now standing as something entirely different. "This pack has faced threats these past weeks that tested everything we believe in," Cale said, his voice carrying clearly across the crowded hall. "We faced them together, and we prevailed, in no small part because of the courage and strength of the woman standing beside me, the last heir of a bloodline our ancestors once fought alongside, and one I intend to honor properly, before this entire court, and beyond it." He turned to Alara then, and to her surprise, lowered himself onto one knee before her, the entire hall falling into stunned silence at the sight of their king kneeling before anyone, let alone the healer many had once viewed simply as a captive Omega serving out her days in quiet obscurity. "Alara, heir of the Lysaria bloodline," Cale said, his voice steady, despite the emotion evident beneath it. "You arrived in this stronghold with no memory of who you were, believing yourself forgotten by whatever family and history once claimed you. I cannot undo the years you lost, nor the pain your bloodline suffered at the hands of ambition and cruelty. But I can offer you this pack's full honor, my complete trust, and my heart, freely given, exactly as you have given yours to me. Will you stand beside me not simply as a healer under my protection, but as my equal, my mate, and the queen this pack has been waiting generations to welcome home?" Tears slipped freely down Alara's face as she looked out at the crowded hall, at Agnes standing with quiet pride near the front, at Grace and Owen exchanging relieved smiles, at the countless faces who had once viewed her with wary suspicion, now watching with genuine warmth and respect. She looked back down at Cale, at the man who had seen past her collar and her captivity from the very first night he walked into the healing wing, who had risked everything to protect a bloodline the world believed extinct. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion but utterly certain. "I will stand beside you, Cale Ravenwood, not as someone forgotten any longer, but as exactly who I was always meant to become." The hall erupted into cheers as Cale rose and gathered her into his arms, sealing their bond with a kiss that spoke of everything they had survived together, and everything still waiting ahead of them. Outside, beyond the stronghold's walls, the mountains stood exactly as they always had, silent witnesses to generations of history, though now they sheltered something new as well. A bloodline once thought lost to fire and cruelty, finally restored, finally remembered, and finally, completely home. In the weeks that followed, word spread throughout the neighboring territories of the Lysaria healer, who had helped defeat 2 would-be conquerors, and claimed her rightful place as queen beside the Ravenwood Alpha King. Some whispered of it with wonder, others with cautious respect, but none dared question the strength of the bond that had proven itself so thoroughly beneath the full moon and amid the chaos of battle alike. Alara often returned to the small garden behind the healing wing in quiet moments, the same garden where she had once overheard Edmund's betrayal, now replanted with herbs she remembered from fragments of her childhood, small green shoots pushing steadily up through the soil, much as her own buried memories had finally pushed their way back into the light. Cale would join her there sometimes, in the quiet hours between his duties, and together they would sit in comfortable silence, watching the garden grow, 2 people bound not simply by ancient bloodlines and old prophecies, but by a trust and love neither of them had expected to find amid captivity and conflict alike. The girl once known only as a useful, forgotten captive had become something the entire pack now recognized clearly. Not a burden to be hidden away, not a weapon to be claimed by force, but a queen whose healing gift and unbreakable spirit had helped restore not only her own bloodline, but the strength and hope of an entire kingdom that had nearly lost its way before she arrived, to remind them exactly what true courage and loyalty looked like. And so, within the walls of the Ravenwood stronghold, beneath mountains that had witnessed both tragedy and triumph across countless generations, the captive healer, who had once believed herself entirely forgotten, finally claimed the place she had always been destined to hold, standing not in captivity, but in freedom, not alone, but beside a king who had seen her worth from the very first night their paths crossed, and would spend the rest of his life honoring it completely.